1939, the evacuees arrive in Stoke. Mrs Brimblecombe was asked to be the voluntary billeting officer for Stoke. Her brief was to find homes for 600 evacuees in the village, as well as school children and their teachers. The evacuees were to include some children under school age and some others with babies and very young children. She therefore set out to visit every house in the village and prepare lists of the accommodation they could offer. Although many houses were small, most people were very generous in agreeing to provide homes for evacuees. The evacuees were scheduled to arrive on 3 consecutive days, and the Castle Street School was to be the reception centre. Some voluntary car drivers were recruited to drive the evacuees to the more distant houses. The authorities thought that some homes might have insufficient blankets, so provided a large number of army blankets, which had been heavily impregnated with moth deterrent. 14-year-old Mary Brimblecombe was enrolled to deliver blankets to the houses in a handcart borrowed from Mr Budge, the grocer. More than 60 years later, she remembered the very pungent smell of those blankets. The best laid schemes of mice and men. And in September 1939, busloads of exhausted evacuees tended to arrive at Stoke School in the middle of the night. Car drivers, such as Freddie Brimblecombe, and cyclists, such as Dorothy Waterman and Mary Brimblecombe, hurried off to wake up the hosts and hostesses and warn them that their evacuees were just about to arrive. Names and addresses were recorded, and more voluntary car drivers took the exhausted travellers to their new homes. When necessary, Mary Brimblecombe followed with the smelly blankets. Problems arose because the numbers of evacuees' mothers with babies and toddlers who arrived vastly exceeded the numbers Stoke had been asked to prepare homes for. Many hosts could perhaps fit in an evacuee schoolboy in a room with their own boys, but could not possibly fit in a mother with babies or toddlers instead. The authorities were apologetic, but adamant that they had nowhere else to send mothers and babies. So wartime emergency powers had to be brought into use, and 2 empty houses belonging to the Duchy of Cornwall were immediately commandeered, one in North Street and one in Ham Hill Road. 3 mothers were accommodated in each of the commandeered houses, and the 6 women between them seemed to possess a vast number of babies and toddlers. Perhaps some of them were triplets. Foreseeing such a possibility, the government authorities had provided some straw-filled mattresses as well as the smelly blankets, but nothing else. As the mothers and babies arrived after midnight, they had to make do with the mattresses and blankets and their emergency rations for the remainder of the night. Next morning, the Brimblecombes hastily donated a few pieces of furniture and kitchen equipment of their own, and Jack Patch kindly lent his horse and cart to transport them to North Street and Ham Hill. Aided by posters, the news that mothers and babies were in virtually unfurnished houses spread around the village very quickly, and Jack Patch and Freddie Brimblecombe spent most of the rest of the day collecting items given by kindly householders and taking them to the evacuees. It says a great deal for the generosity of the people of Stoke that when Mrs Brimblecombe called the 2 houses that evening, she found them both furnished and equipped. The occupants reported that they had everything they needed, except, as one mother added, "The only thing we haven't got is a calendar to hang on the wall." The voluntary duties as billeting officer continued throughout the war. As circumstances in households changed, evacuees had to be moved to new foster homes. During the Phoney War, when there were few air raids, many evacuees returned to London and then had to be reaccommodated in Stoke when the Blitz began. Heavy bombing of Bristol also brought many evacuees to the village. Children sometimes arrived with only the clothes they stood up in. Soon, clothing was rationed on coupons, so outgrown children's clothing had to be sought for from Somerset people. Friends, neighbours and relatives did their best. Large numbers of children had to be fitted into school at Stoke, and the girls from Charles Edward Brooke Grammar School in London, who were evacuated to Stoke, had to be fitted into Yeovil Girls High School for lessons held in shifts. An annual event was the evacuees' Christmas party, given by Mrs Brimblecombe and her energetic band of helpers. As the front door and telephone at Pranketts was already in constant use by patients, Mrs Brimblecombe borrowed an empty shop and spent an hour there every morning answering queries from the callers who had problems in connection with the evacuees and doing her best to solve them quickly. Stanley Brimblecombe already had the largest single-handed practice in Somerset. As well as Stoke, the other 8 villages in his practice also received their quotas of evacuees in September 1939. This meant that the number of patients must have increased by well over 1,000 overnight and made him an extremely busy man. This was particularly so in September 1939 because many of the children from London had never been in the country before. For the first few days they went wild with excitement. They fell into ponds, climbed trees and fell off the branches and broke arms or legs. They stuffed themselves with unripe apples and got violent tummy upsets. They climbed barbed wire fences and cut themselves. They prodded unsuspecting cows and horses and got kicked. So altogether, a great deal of time had to be spent treating these young casualties. Accommodating so many extra people meant that houses were crowded, and it was difficult to nurse any evacuee children who fell ill. So a sick bay for evacuees was opened at Yarn Barton in West Chinook. It was staffed by resident nurses, and Stanley Brimblecombe visited the young patients daily. A little patient at Yarn Barton was Barbara from London, who had to be in bed there for a very long time due to heart trouble. Barbara never received any letters or messages from her parents, and all efforts to trace them had failed. It was suspected that they had been killed in an air raid, and their records had somehow gone astray. Stanley Brimblecombe was fond of children and was concerned for Barbara, so he persuaded the younger members of his own family to send letters and parcels to her. Eventually, Barbara improved sufficiently to move to a home for invalid children, and the WVS in that area took on the task of visiting her and providing little treats. As well as being the billeting officer, Mrs Brimblecombe was also head of the WVS at Stoke, now the Women's Royal Voluntary Service. She and her helpers carried out numerous tasks in this respect. These included recruiting blood donors and providing a room and refreshments for when the National Blood Transfusion Service came to Stoke for donor sessions. The war had made oranges unobtainable for making the vital orange juice for babies. Instead, rose hip syrup was provided for them, and vast quantities of rose hips had to be gathered for the purpose. Jam was made when a special allocation of sugar was issued, and for some reason, now forgotten, large quantities of raspberry leaves had also to be collected.